She didn't hear him come in. Arms wrapped around her from behind, mid-turn, and Ziona gasped and spun hard, ready to fight, ready for anything, until she saw his face. Dae-Ho. "You scared me," she breathed, chest heaving, still catching air from the dance, from the fear, from 3 days of barely sleeping. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. "I just couldn't watch you carry this alone anymore." Her husband was in a hospital bed across the city, unconscious, unaware, fighting for his life after an attack no one could fully explain yet. And here she was, dancing alone at midnight, just to keep from falling apart. But it wasn't comfort she saw in Dae-Ho's eyes right now. It was something that had been waiting a very long time for a door like this one to finally open. If you've ever wondered how far quiet loyalty can bend before it breaks into something else entirely, stay close. This one's going to hurt in a different way than the first. Before we go further, do you think Dae-Ho came to comfort her or came for something else? Drop your guess below. And if you're still with this family after everything they've survived, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Afro-Korean Drama Tales is just getting started. 3 days ago, Min-Jun Choi was a man who had survived 20 years in a business that didn't forgive weakness. Now he lay in a hospital bed, hooked to machines that breathed for him when his own body forgot how to, while the city outside continued as if nothing had cracked open at all. The official story was simple: a rival faction, a targeted ambush, a boss caught without enough protection around him for once. Everyone accepted it because it was the kind of story their world produced regularly enough not to question. Everyone except Jerome, who had started noticing details that didn't sit right, a timeline that didn't quite add up, a warning that should have reached Min-Jun sooner than it did, a silence from the one man who always knew everything before anyone else did. Dae-Ho, the man who loved Ziona first, years ago in a church basement half a world away, the man who had stepped aside so his boss could have her. The man who had spent 15 years proving loyalty was the deepest kind of love there was. But loyalty, when it goes unrewarded long enough, doesn't always stay loyalty. What really happened the night Min-Jun was attacked? Why does Dae-Ho seem more present now than he ever was before? And what does Ziona not yet know about the man standing closest to her in her darkest hour? Keep watching, because sometimes the danger isn't the enemy at the gate. Sometimes it's the man who's been standing guard the whole time. Life had settled into something Ziona hadn't dared imagine possible in her marriage: honesty. Min-Jun came to her studio most evenings after work, standing near the door the way Dae-Ho once had, watching her teach children the steps she'd learned in a church basement half a lifetime ago. There were no more locked drawers between them, no more careful omissions, just a marriage, finally, fully lived. Dae-Ho watched all of it unfold from the outside, the way he always had, present at family dinners, present at the studio's opening, present at every anniversary, every small celebration, every quiet Sunday. Present, but never fully included in the warmth he witnessed, a man standing permanently in a doorway of someone else's happy home. He told himself it didn't matter. He had told himself for 15 years, and the telling had become a kind of prayer he repeated so often he'd stopped noticing the doubt underneath it. It was a small moment that started the unraveling. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would have noticed. Dae-Ho sat alone in his apartment on a Tuesday night, the kind of ordinary evening that had repeated itself 1,000 times over 15 years, and found himself doing something he'd never allowed himself to do before. He counted, not money, not favors owed. He counted the things he'd given up, the confession he'd swallowed instead of spoken, the woman he'd stepped back from instead of pursued, the nights he'd spent standing guard over someone else's happiness instead of building his own. 15 years of careful, dutiful restraint, and what did he have to show for it? An apartment that echoed, a loyalty that had never once been asked to prove itself in a way that mattered to him. He'd always believed that loyalty was its own reward, that the nobility of the sacrifice was the point, that watching Ziona and Min-Jun rebuild something honest and whole was supposed to feel like enough. It didn't feel like enough anymore. It felt, increasingly, like punishment for a crime he hadn't known he was committing. The crime of loving someone quietly enough that no one, including her, ever had to reckon with it. The anniversary dinner should have been simple. 22 years, a private room at a restaurant Min-Jun favored, a toast Dae-Ho had given at every anniversary for over a decade, the words so familiar he could deliver them without thinking. "To Min-Jun and Ziona," he said, raising his glass, the same warm smile in place, the same steady voice. "May you keep finding new ways to know each other, the way you have this past year especially." No one noticed anything wrong. No one ever did. That was the particular cruelty of being a man so skilled at composure. The mask had become so seamless that even he sometimes forgot where his face ended and the performance began. But that night, driving home alone, something in him finally cracked loud enough for him to hear it. "I gave her away. I gave her away, and I have spent 15 years applauding the man I gave her to." Dae-Ho began, almost without admitting it to himself, paying closer attention to the tensions simmering at the edges of Min-Jun's organization. A rival faction, the Song family, who had spent years testing the boundaries of Min-Jun's territory, probing for weaknesses, waiting for an opening. He didn't plan anything yet, not consciously. He told himself he was simply doing his job, gathering intelligence, staying useful the way he always had. But some part of him had already begun calculating something darker, a scenario where Min-Jun's guard slipped, where the Song family's aggression found its mark, where the aftermath left a wife frightened, vulnerable, and in need of exactly the kind of steady presence Dae-Ho had spent 15 years perfecting. He told himself he wasn't planning anything. He told himself that every single day, right up until the day it stopped being true. A meeting came across his desk, routine, the kind of intelligence report he processed dozens of times a year. The Song family was planning a show of force, a warming shot meant to remind Min-Jun's organization they hadn't forgotten old grievances. Normally, Dae-Ho would have flagged it immediately, escalated it, made sure Min-Jun had triple the usual protection for the window of exposure. This time, he sat with the report for 2 full days before mentioning it. And when he finally did mention it, he undersold the threat, just enough to ensure the response felt adequate rather than overwhelming, just enough that Min-Jun's usual armor of caution would have one small gap in it. He told himself it was a mistake, an oversight, understandable given how distracted he'd been. He told himself that every night for 6 weeks. Ziona noticed something different in Dae-Ho during this stretch, a quality she couldn't quite name, a distance dressed up as extra attentiveness. He started showing up to the studio more often, staying longer after class, asking about her day with a focus that felt, in retrospect, almost rehearsed. "You've been different lately," she told him one evening, locking up the studio while he waited by his car to walk her to it, a habit he'd maintained for years without her ever questioning it. "Different how?" "I don't know. Present. More present than usual." She meant it as a compliment. She had no idea yet what it actually meant. Dae-Ho smiled the smile he'd perfected over 15 years. "I suppose I've just been thinking about how much I value this family, all of it, more than I used to let myself admit." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth, either. The same kind of half-honesty Ziona herself had lived inside for 18 years before she'd learned better. She didn't recognize the echo of her own old patterns reflected back at her through someone else's eyes. Why would she? She had no reason yet to be looking for it. Min-Jun himself noticed nothing wrong. If anything, he leaned more on Dae-Ho during this period, trusting his oldest friend's judgment the way he always had, never once suspecting that the man beside him had begun, quietly, to resent every single thing about the life Min-Jun had built. "You've earned a life of your own, you know," Min-Jun told him once, over the kind of late dinner they'd shared hundreds of times over 15 years. "You don't have to spend all your time looking after mine." "I don't mind," Dae-Ho said, and meant it, and also didn't mean it at all. Both truths sitting inside him at once, the way contradictions do when a person has spent too long avoiding the harder one. "Still, you should find someone, build something of your own." Dae-Ho smiled and changed the subject, the way he always did when the conversation drifted too close to the wound he'd spent 15 years pretending had healed clean. The Song family's planned show of force grew more specific in the intelligence Dae-Ho continued to receive. A date, a location, a level of aggression higher than he'd initially reported. He had every opportunity to correct his earlier assessment, to bring Min-Jun's full protective response back up to where it should have been. He didn't. He told himself it still wasn't a decision, not really, just an accumulation of smaller choices that hadn't quite added up to anything yet. He told himself Min-Jun's instincts were sharp enough to handle whatever came, that nothing truly dangerous would happen, that this was simply an opportunity for Min-Jun to be reminded he wasn't invincible, to lean, briefly, on the people around him. He told himself many things in those 2 weeks. Very few of them were honest. Jerome, working at the studio now, humbled and rebuilding trust after his own mistakes from Part 1, mentioned something in passing to Ziona that would only matter much later. A conversation he'd overheard between 2 of Min-Jun's men discussing an upcoming situation with the Song family in a tone that suggested less concern than the stakes seemed to warrant. "Probably nothing," Jerome said at the time. "Just background noise in that world, I guess." Ziona nodded, distracted, thinking nothing more of it. She had learned to live at a careful distance from the operational details of her husband's world, a boundary that had kept her sane for over 2 decades, and one that would, in the coming weeks, leave her dangerously unaware of exactly the kind of danger circling her family. Min-Jun left a meeting later than expected, his usual security detail thinner than it should have been, a gap Dae-Ho had quietly engineered weeks earlier through careful undersell and convenient scheduling. The Song family's planned show of force arrived with more aggression than anyone had prepared for, a confrontation that spiraled faster and further than even they had apparently intended. Min-Jun was struck, not by a weapon meant to kill, the aftermath would later clarify, but by the chaos of a scene that spun out of anyone's full control, a fall, a collision, a blow to the head that left him unconscious before anyone could stop it. Dae-Ho arrived at the hospital within the hour, his face arranged into exactly the right proportions of shock and concern, a performance so seamless that not one person in that waiting room, not Ziona, not the doctors, not the men who worked beside him every day, suspected for even a moment that some part of what happened traced back, quietly, deliberately, to a report he chose not to escalate. Standing over Min-Jun's hospital bed that first night, watching the machines breathe for the only man who had ever fully trusted him, something flickered across Dae-Ho's face that he didn't examine too closely. Horror first, genuine, sharp, disorienting horror at what his small, accumulated choices had actually produced. And beneath the horror, quieter, colder, unwelcome even to him, this could still work in my favor. He hated that thought the moment it arrived. He let it stay anyway.
The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and fear, a combination Ziona hadn't encountered since her mother's final weeks, 2 decades and an ocean away. She sat in a plastic chair outside the ICU, still wearing the dress she'd had on the night before, refusing to leave, refusing to sleep, refusing anything that felt like giving up on the man behind that door. Dae-Ho arrived before the sun fully rose, carrying coffee she wouldn't drink and a steadiness she desperately needed. "You should rest," he said, sitting beside her, close but not too close, the careful geometry he'd maintained around her for 18 years. "I can't. I know." He didn't push. He never pushed. That had always been part of what made him safe, the fact that he never asked her for anything, never needed anything from her that she couldn't easily give. "I'm not going anywhere, Ziona. Whatever you need, for as long as you need it." She looked at him then, really looked, grateful in a way that made her chest ache. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you right now." She meant it as simple gratitude. She had no idea it would become the exact sentence that gave him permission to keep going. 2 days later, Min-Jun remained unconscious, stable but unchanged, the doctors offering careful, hedged language that gave Ziona nothing solid to hold on to. She stopped sleeping properly, she stopped eating regularly, and when she did eat, her stomach turned on her without warning, sharp waves of nausea she attributed, without much thought, to grief and terror and too much hospital coffee on an empty stomach. A nurse named Grace, kind-eyed and observant in the way people become after years of watching families fall apart in hospital corridors, found Ziona doubled over near a vending machine on the 3rd morning, pale and shaking. "When did you last eat a real meal?" Grace asked, guiding her to a chair. "I don't remember. Days, maybe. And when was your last cycle?" Ziona blinked at her, the question landing sideways, unprepared for it. She did the math slowly, her mind foggy with exhaustion, and felt something cold drop through her chest as the weeks added up wrong. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't been paying attention to anything except him." Grace's expression softened into something gentle and knowing. "Let's run a quick test, just to rule things out. No harm in knowing." 20 minutes later, the result came back positive, and Ziona sat alone in a small exam room, holding a piece of paper that changed the entire shape of her fear. She pressed a hand flat against her stomach, disbelief and terror, and something achingly tender, all tangled together at once. A child, Min-Jun's child, growing inside her while he lay unconscious, 3 floors up, with no idea, no certainty he would ever wake to learn it. She didn't tell anyone that day. She sat with it alone, the way she'd once sat alone with so many truths in her life, needing time to let it settle into something she could carry without shattering. That week at the studio, Ziona forced herself back to the studio because the alternative, sitting still with her fear, now doubled, felt unsurvivable. She kept classes running for the children who depended on her, smiling through lessons on footwork and rhythm, while her husband lay unconscious across the city, and a secret grew quietly inside her that she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Jerome noticed the toll it was taking on her before anyone else did, the hollows under her eyes, the new way she pressed a hand absently to her stomach when she thought no one was looking, a gesture he couldn't quite place but that struck him as new.
"You don't have to teach today, Jerome," he told her gently, catching her alone in the studio office. "I can cover your classes. You should be resting, or at the hospital, or anything other than pushing yourself this hard." "If I stop moving, I'll fall apart, Jerome. This is the only thing keeping me upright right now." It was truer now than she let him know. She was keeping two lives upright, not just her own. He didn't argue further, but he started paying closer attention to her, to the organization's version of events about the attack, to the small inconsistencies that had been nagging at him since the conversation he'd overheard weeks earlier. Late that night, the hospital. Ziona sat beside Min-Jun's bed that evening longer than usual, holding his small, responsive hand, the slip of paper with her test results folded in her coat pocket like something too fragile to unfold in front of anyone yet, even him.
"There's something I need to tell you," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her, though the machines only answered with their steady, indifferent rhythm. "I'm pregnant, Min-Jun. We're having a child, and you don't even know it yet. And I don't know how to carry this without you here to carry it with me." She pressed his hand gently against her stomach, tears sliding down her face in the dim light, willing some part of him, wherever he was, to feel it. She stayed at the studio after that, unable to face the silence of an apartment that felt too large and too quiet without Min-Jun in it, the weight of her secret pressing against her chest along with everything else. She turned the lights down low, put on music that meant nothing and everything, and let her body do what her mind couldn't manage anymore. Process the unbearable weight of not knowing whether her husband would ever open his eyes again, whether he'd ever know about the child they'd made before everything fell apart. She danced like it could hold the ceiling up, grief and fragile hope translated into motion, because words had stopped working days ago, because sitting still meant feeling everything at once, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Might never be ready for that. She didn't hear the door. She didn't hear his footsteps. Dae-Ho's arms circled her from behind, gentle, certain, and for one disoriented half-second, exhausted and raw, she nearly let herself lean back into it without question. "You scared me," she breathed, chest heaving. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. "I just couldn't watch you carry this alone anymore." If only he knew how much she was truly carrying alone. Standing that close to her, watching her chest rise and fall, from the dance, from the fear, from 3 days of barely holding herself together, something surfaced across Dae-Ho's face for just a moment, something he usually kept buried so deep even he sometimes forgot it was there. Hunger. Not the crude, simple kind, the kind that comes from 18 years of careful restraint finally reaching the end of its patience. Ziona stepped back instinctively, some old, sharp part of her recognizing the change in the air even before her conscious mind caught up to name it, her hand moving unconsciously to rest over her stomach in a small protective gesture she didn't fully register herself making. "Dae-Ho." "I'm sorry," he said quickly, the mask sliding back into place almost seamlessly. "I didn't mean anything by that. I just meant that you shouldn't be alone right now. I meant that as a friend." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. He was, after all, one of the only steady things left in a world that had gone suddenly unstable. So she let herself believe him, because the alternative was a fear she didn't have room for, on top of everything else she was already carrying. But some small, quiet part of her filed the moment away anyway, the way she used to file away warning signs in her old life in Atlanta, back before she'd learned it was safer to notice things early. The next morning,
Jerome found Ziona at the studio earlier than usual, quieter than usual, moving through her morning routine with a distracted heaviness that hadn't been there the day before. "Everything okay?" he asked, carefully. "I don't know," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "Dae-Ho came by last night. Something felt different. I don't know how to explain it." She paused, then added, quieter, "And I found out something else, something I haven't told anyone yet." "You don't have to tell me," Jerome said gently, "but I'm here if you need somewhere to put it." She hesitated only a moment before the words came out, small and disbelieving. "I'm pregnant." Jerome's face softened into something warm despite everything. "Ziona, that's good news, isn't it? Even now?" "It should be," she said, tears rising unexpectedly. "It should be the best news of my life, but I don't know if he'll ever wake up to hear it, Jerome. I don't know how to hold that much joy and that much fear at the same time." Jerome sat with her in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it settle before he spoke again. "Then let's focus on getting him back to you, both of you." Jerome began quietly asking questions, careful, indirect, the kind that wouldn't raise alarm if he was wrong. He reached out to a contact he still had inside the Song family's orbit, someone he'd known back when he'd first arrived in Seoul, chasing leverage instead of belonging. "That confrontation with Choi's man," Jerome asked carefully, framing it as idle curiosity. "Was it really as spontaneous as everyone's saying?" The contact hesitated just long enough to confirm Jerome's suspicion before answering. "We were told the timing would work. Someone made sure the window was there. I don't know who. I don't want to know who." Jerome sat with that information for a long time after the call ended, turning it over, testing it against everything he knew about the people around Ziona. It didn't take him long to arrive at the name he least wanted to consider: Dae-Ho. That same week at the hospital, Ziona sat beside Min-Jun's bed each evening, one hand holding his, the other resting protectively over the small, still flat curve of her stomach, talking to him the way the nurses had encouraged her to, in case some part of him could still hear her. "You have to come back," she told him quietly one night, the room dim except for the soft glow of monitoring equipment. "You have to come back because I don't know how to keep doing this without you, because there's someone new counting on you now too, even if you don't know it yet." Dae-Ho, arriving later that evening to check on her, the way he had every night that week, paused outside the door before entering, listening to her voice through the gap, catching only fragments, enough to hear tenderness, not enough to hear the words that would have changed everything for him. He entered anyway, composing his face back into careful concern before she saw him. "How is he tonight?" he asked, settling into the chair on the other side of the bed. "The same. The doctors say that's not necessarily bad, just unclear." "You need to eat something, Ziona. You've barely stopped moving in days." "I have more reason to eat than you know," she said quietly, not yet ready to tell him the truth, some instinct she couldn't name, keeping the words locked behind her teeth around this particular man. Dae-Ho reached across the bed and took her hand, not Min-Jun's, hers, holding it with a gentleness that felt, in the moment, indistinguishable from simple comfort. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "I meant that last night, and I mean it now. Whatever happens with him, whatever you need, I am not going anywhere. I never have been." The words should have felt reassuring. Instead, something in the phrasing snagged at her, though she was too exhausted to examine why. She simply nodded, let him hold her hand a moment longer than she probably should have, and turned her attention back to her unconscious husband, willing him, with everything she had left, to open his eyes and meet the child she now carried for both of them. Jerome finally worked up the resolve to bring his suspicions to Ziona, though he approached it as carefully as he could, aware of how much was already breaking her, unwilling to add a fracture he wasn't yet fully certain of. "I need to tell you something," he said, finding her alone in the studio's small office, "and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Jerome, I don't have the capacity for anything else right now. It's about the attack, about Dae-Ho." Ziona went very still, one hand instinctively moving to rest over her stomach. "I don't have proof yet," Jerome continued carefully, "but I have a contact who told me the timing of that confrontation wasn't as spontaneous as everyone's been told. Someone made sure the window was there, and I keep thinking about the fact that Dae-Ho is the one person who's had complete control over every piece of information since it happened." "That's not—" Ziona started, then stopped, the protest dying in her throat as something cold slid through her chest, unbidden, unwelcome. The moment in the studio, his arms around her, the hunger she'd seen and immediately talked herself out of believing. "I know how this sounds," Jerome said gently. "I know he's family to you both. I know how much he's done for you. But Ziona, I need you to really think about the last few weeks."
Has anything about him felt different to you? Anything at all? Ziona sat down slowly, her hands beginning to tremble in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion this time. "Yes," she whispered, "something has felt different. I just didn't want to look at it too closely. And now I have more than just myself to protect, Jerome. I can't afford to keep looking away." That same night, Ziona didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the lights off, the city glittering faintly through the window, one hand resting over her stomach, turning Jerome's words over and over until they stopped sounding impossible and started sounding horribly like they fit. She thought about the toast at their anniversary dinner, the one that had always struck her as slightly too polished, too rehearsed, though she'd never let herself examine why. She thought about the past few months, Dae-Ho lingering longer at the studio, appearing at moments that in hindsight felt less like coincidence and more like positioning. She thought about his hands on her waist in the dark of the studio, the half-second before she'd pulled away, the hunger she'd seen, and immediately talked herself into misreading as simple grief. And she thought about the attack itself. How quickly, how completely Dae-Ho had taken control of the narrative. How he'd been the one briefing the police, the one managing the organization's response, the one standing closest to her at every turn since Min-Jun's body had hit the ground. By morning, she had made a decision. She would not confront him with accusations. She would give him room to reveal himself, the way she'd learned all those years ago that people often did when they believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. Jerome arranged a meeting with a second contact, someone closer to the actual confrontation, a low-level member of the Song family who'd been present that night and was willing to talk, quietly, for a price Jerome was willing to pay out of his own pocket. What the contact described made Jerome's stomach turn. The spontaneous confrontation had, in fact, been carefully seeded, a tip about Min-Jun's schedule, a suggestion about thin security, delivered through an intermediary 2 weeks before the attack. The intermediary's description matched no one the Song family recognized personally, which meant the leak had come from someone deep inside Min-Jun's own organization, someone trusted enough to move information without anyone thinking to look twice. Ziona called Jerome the moment he returned from his meeting, meeting him in the small studio office with the door closed, her voice low and controlled in a way that frightened him more than if she'd been shouting.
"Tell me everything," she said. Jerome told her, the intermediary, the leak, the description that fit no one but a man inside Min-Jun's own inner circle. He watched something in her face go very still and very cold, the particular stillness of someone finally allowing themselves to see a truth they'd spent days not to look at directly. "I need to talk to him, alone," Ziona said. "Ziona, if he's capable of what we think he's capable of, and in your condition—" "He won't hurt me, Jerome. Whatever else is true, I know that much. He's loved me for 18 years. That's not nothing, even if it's twisted into something ugly now. I need to hear it from him. I need to see his face when I ask." Jerome didn't like it, but he understood, in a way he hadn't expected to, the particular need to face a betrayal directly, rather than let it stay a shadow you could almost convince yourself wasn't real. "I'll be close," said Jerome. "If anything feels wrong, you call out. I mean it."
Ziona arrived at Dae-Ho's apartment unannounced, and he opened the door with the same steady warmth he always greeted her with, though something flickered behind his eyes at the sight of her there, alone, at an hour that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Ziona, is everything all right? Is it Min-Jun?" "He's the same," she said, stepping past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I need to ask you something, Dae-Ho, and I need you to be honest with me. After everything, after 18 years, I think you owe me that much." He closed the door slowly, something in his posture straining, the careful composure of 15 years beginning almost imperceptibly to give way at its seams. "Ask me anything." "Did you know about the attack before it happened?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for Ziona to feel the floor tilt beneath her, long enough for her to understand with a sick, sinking certainty that she already had her answer before he spoke a single word. "Ziona, did you know?" Her voice cracked on the second word, grief and fury tangled together in a way she'd never experienced before, not even in her worst moments with Min-Jun. "Did you let it happen? Did you make it happen?" Dae-Ho sat down slowly, his hands trembling now in a way she had never once seen him from in 18 years of steady, unshakable presence. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its careful control, all its practiced warmth, leaving only something raw and exhausted underneath. "I didn't plan for him to be hurt this badly. I swear to you, Ziona, I never wanted this. I only meant— I don't even know what I meant anymore. I told myself for weeks it was nothing, a small oversight, an undersold report. I told myself I wasn't really doing anything at all." "You let a threat through," Ziona said, her voice shaking. "You let people hurt him. You let him almost die, Dae-Ho. Why?" He looked up at her then, and for the first time in 18 years, she saw the whole truth of him laid bare. Not the steady protector, not the loyal friend, but a man who had spent 15 years watching him have everything. Everything I ever wanted. You, a family, a life built on love instead of duty. And I told myself every single day that my loyalty was noble, that stepping back for him was the deepest kind of love there was. But somewhere along the way, Ziona, it stopped feeling noble. It just felt like punishment, like I'd given away the only thing I ever wanted and gotten nothing in return except more of the same. More waiting, more standing in doorways, more watching someone else live the life I should have fought for. "So you tried to take it," Ziona said, horror settling cold and absolute into her chest. "You tried to break us apart so you could have what was left." "I didn't think of it like that, not clearly. I told myself I was just
creating space for you to see me differently if the worst happened. I never let myself think the words out loud, not even to myself, because I think some part of me always knew how monstrous they'd sound. They sound monstrous, Dae-Ho, because they are. Tears ran freely down her face now, and she pressed a hand flat against her stomach, the gesture instinctive, protective. My husband is lying in a hospital bed because you couldn't sit with your own disappointment honestly. And there's something else you don't know, something that makes what you did even harder for me to forgive. Dae-Ho's eyes went to her hand, to the small, deliberate way she held it against herself, and something shifted in his face, understanding arriving a beat before she said the words. "I'm pregnant," Ziona said quietly. "I found out 3 days after the attack. Min-Jun doesn't even know yet. He might have woken up to learn he was about to be a father, Dae-Ho. He might never wake up at all, and if he doesn't, our child will never know him, because of a choice you made out of jealousy you never dared to name honestly." Dae-Ho made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something broken and involuntary, his hands coming up to cover his face as his shoulders began to shake. "I didn't know," he said, voice muffled, wrecked. "God, Ziona, I didn't know. I would never have—"
I would never have. I need you to believe that much at least. Whatever else I've done, I would never have wanted to take a father from a child. But you were willing to take a husband from me, Ziona said. You were willing to take everything, Dae-Ho, and just hope it worked out in your favor afterward. That's the truth of what you did. I don't think you get to soften it just because you didn't know all the stakes." Dae-Ho put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking now, something collapsing in him that had been held rigidly in place for 15 years. "I know," he said, barely audible. "I know, and I hate what I've become more than you could possibly hate me right now. I have spent every night since the attack telling myself it was an accident, a coincidence, anything other than the truth. But I've known since I stood over his hospital bed that first night and felt something monstrous flicker through me, the thought that this might still work in my favor. I hated myself the instant I thought it. I hated myself, and I let it stay anyway." Outside, in the hallway, Jerome was listening close enough to hear raised voices without making out every word, made the call he'd promised Ziona he wouldn't have to make unless things went wrong. Not because she was in danger from Dae-Ho exactly, but because some truths need more than 2 people in the room to hold their full weight. He called the one number that mattered most. Min-Jun's second in command, a steady, trusted man named Sang-Hun, who had served the organization for over a decade and had no reason, unlike Dae-Ho, to protect anyone's secrets at Min-Jun's expense. Sang-Hun arrived with 2 other men, his face grim, having already begun piecing together the same suspicions Jerome had, once Jerome laid out what he'd learned. Dae-Ho didn't resist. He sat exactly where Ziona had left him, hollowed out, the fight gone out of him entirely, as though some part of him had been waiting, quietly, for this exact reckoning for weeks. "I won't run," Dae-Ho told Sang-Hun quietly. "I don't have it in me to run from this. I've spent 15 years running from the truth of what I wanted. I'm tired of running from things." Min-Jun's eyes opened on a quiet Tuesday morning, 9 days after the attack, 9 days that had aged Ziona in ways she suspected would never fully reverse. He blinked slowly at the ceiling, confused, disoriented, before his gaze found her sitting beside his bed, exhausted and radiant with relief all at once. "You're here," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I never left," she said, gripping his hand so tightly it must have hurt him, though he didn't complain. "I never once left Min-Jun." The doctors ran their tests, cautiously optimistic, warning of a long recovery ahead, but confirming gently that the worst appeared to be behind him. Ziona held that news the way she'd once held her breath before a dance, carefully, like something that might shatter if she moved too fast. Later that same day, once the doctors had finished, once the room had quieted, Ziona took Min-Jun's hand and pressed it gently against her stomach, the way she'd done uselessly to his unconscious body just days before, except now his eyes were open, now he was here to feel it and understand. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, tears already rising. "I found out 3 days after the attack. I've been carrying this news for you this whole time, hoping you'd wake up to hear it yourself." Min-Jun's brow furrowed, confusion giving way slowly to understanding, then to something breaking open across his face that had nothing to do with grief. "Ziona, we're having a baby, Min-Jun." He stared at her for a long moment, his hand still resting against her stomach, and then, weak as he was, he laughed, a small, disbelieving, joyful sound that startled a nurse checking his monitors in the hallway. "After everything," he said, voice cracking, "after everything that's happened, this is the news you're giving me right now?" "I didn't know how else to give it to you," she said, laughing and crying at once. "I've been sitting on it for over a week, terrified I'd have to raise this child, telling stories about a father they never got to meet." "You won't have to," Min-Jun said, pulling her hand to his lips. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere."
Neither of you are getting rid of me that easily. 2 days later, once he was stable enough to hear the rest. Telling Min-Jun about Dae-Ho was the hardest conversation of Ziona's life, harder even than the confession of her own hidden past all those months earlier. She sat beside his hospital bed and told him everything: the leaked intelligence, the engineered gap in security, the confession Dae-Ho had finally given her, raw and broken, in his apartment. Min-Jun listened in silence, his face unreadable in the particular way it became when he was absorbing something too large to react to immediately. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling, processing a betrayal from the one man he had trusted more completely than almost anyone else in his life. 15 years, he finally said. 15 years, and I never once saw it. "Neither did I," Ziona said gently. "That's not a failure of either of us, Min-Jun. That's what happens when someone spends that long convincing even themselves that what they're feeling doesn't exist. He hid it from all of us. He hid it from himself, too, for as long as he could. Does that make it forgivable?" "I don't know," Ziona admitted. "I don't think I'm ready to answer that yet. I just know that hating him completely feels like it would erase 15 years of real loyalty that existed alongside whatever ugliness grew underneath it. Both things were true. I don't know how to hold both at once yet. What I do know is that our child is going to grow up safe and loved and far away from whatever poison finally caught up with him." Min-Jun, recovering slowly, chose not to pursue violent retribution, consistent with the man Ziona had always known him to be, a man who solved things quietly rather than brutally, even when brutality would have been easier, even when it might have felt, in the moment, deserved. Instead, Dae-Ho was exiled from the organization entirely, stripped of the position and trust he'd spent 15 years building, sent away from Seoul with enough resources to start over somewhere far from the life he'd nearly destroyed, and a clear, unambiguous warning that he would never be welcome near either of them again. "I don't forgive you," Min-Jun told him during the one conversation they had before Dae-Ho left the city for good. Min-Jun still weak from his injuries, but steady enough to face the man who'd nearly taken his life. "I don't know if I ever will, but I understand you, Dae-Ho, and that terrifies me more than hating you would.
because I understand exactly what 15 years of unspoken want can curdle into if a person lets it fester long enough in silence. I loved her first, Dae-Ho said quietly, not as an excuse, simply as the last true thing he had to offer. I told myself for 15 years that loving her meant staying quiet. I was wrong about that. I think I always knew I was wrong about that, and I let the wrongness grow anyway, because it was easier than admitting I wanted something for myself. Tell her, tell them both, that I hope the child never inherits anything of what I became. That's a legacy you don't get to worry about anymore, Min-Jun said. That's ours to carry now, not yours. It's been 4 months since Min-Jun regained his strength, slowly, week by week, walking the studio floor again, then standing at Ziona's side while she taught, then finally, carefully, dancing with her once more in the quiet evenings after the children had gone home. Slower than before, more careful of her changing body, but present in a way that felt like everything they'd both fought to protect. Jerome remained at the studio, steadier now than he'd ever been, having found in this second act of his life something like genuine purpose, not chasing recognition the way he once had, but building something real, one honest day at a time, the way Ziona herself had learned to. Ziona's labor began on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of unremarkable day that made the sudden urgency of it feel almost unbelievable. Min-Jun, fully recovered by then, drove her to the hospital himself, his hands steady on the wheel, despite everything, murmuring reassurance the entire way. The labor was long, difficult, exhausting in ways Ziona hadn't fully prepared herself for, despite months of anticipation. But Min-Jun stayed beside her through every hour of it, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, whispering the same words he'd whispered the night in the hospital when she'd told him the news. "I'm here. Neither of you are getting rid of me that easily." Just after 2 in the morning, their son was born, small, furious, and loud, filling the room with a cry that Ziona would later say was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, more beautiful even than the music that used to move her feet in a church basement half a world away. They named him Kwame Min-Ho. Kwame for the grandfather Ziona had lost too young to ever meet him, Min-Ho carrying forward his father's name into a new generation, born out of everything the family had survived to reach this moment. "He has your stubbornness already," Min-Jun murmured, watching his son grip his finger with surprising strength, refusing to let go. "Good," Ziona said, exhausted and radiant, tears sliding freely down her face. "This family could use a little more of that. We've survived enough this year to know exactly how much it matters." Min-Jun leaned down and kissed her forehead, then the crown of his son's head, something settling fully into place in his chest for the first time since the night of the attack, a peace that felt finally earned rather than merely hoped for. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we face it together, all 3 of us now." Some loyalties are built to last a lifetime. Others are built on silence, and silence, given enough time, always finds a way to break. But out of every betrayal this family survived, something new was born anyway, proof that love, chosen honestly and fought for completely, always finds a way to keep going. If you've ever wondered whether a family can survive betrayal from someone who claimed to love them, let this story be your answer. Survival isn't the absence of pain. It's choosing again and again to build something new out of what's left. What do you think baby Kwame Min-Ho will grow up to become, given everything his parents survived before he arrived? Tell us below. We'd love to hear your guess. And if this family's story has held on to a piece of you the way it's held on to us, you already know where to find more.